His family left him to die alone. Then something found him. My name is Dwayne Pritchard. I'm 72 years old, and I'm done keeping this secret. October 2019. My own son pushed me off a scree slope in the Absaroka Range and left me for dead. All for 40 acres and a cabin. Shattered femur, no pack, no rifle. Temperatures below 20 degrees. The doctors said I should have died by day 4. I lasted 11. Not because I'm tough, not because of survival instinct, but because every morning, food appeared within arm's reach that I didn't gather. Because a shelter grew around me that I didn't build. Because something watched me from the darkness with eyes too high off the ground to be any animal I've ever known. The official report says, wilderness misadventure. The ranger measured those 18-inch tracks and wrote, probable bear. You can believe that if you want. But my own blood chose to let me die. Something else chose different. I've been waiting 5 years to say this out loud. I live in the Mountain View Assisted Care Center in Thermopolis, Wyoming, which is a nice way of saying I live in the place where people go when their bodies have given up, but their hearts keep beating anyway. I've got a room with a window that looks out at the Owl Creek Mountains, and on clear mornings I can almost pretend I'm somewhere else. Almost. I spent 31 years with Wyoming Game and Fish. Started in 1981 when I was 27, right after I finished my wildlife management certification and 4 years of ranch security work that taught me more about animal behavior than any classroom ever could. I retired in 2012. In those 3 decades, I participated in more search and rescue operations than I can count. Found lost hikers, recovered bodies, tracked wounded elk through terrain that would make most men quit before lunch. I knew the Absaroka Range the way some people know their own living rooms. Every drainage, every ridge, every game trail that the maps don't show. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand something. I'm not a man who sees things that aren't there. I'm not someone who panics in the backcountry. I've stared down grizzlies at 15 yards and kept my breathing steady. I've spent nights alone in places so remote that the stars looked close enough to touch, and I slept fine. What happened in October of 2019 wasn't panic. It wasn't hypothermia playing tricks on a dying brain, and it sure as hell wasn't a bear. The official version is simple. It made the local news in Cody for about 2 days. Elderly man separated from hunting party. Survives 11 days with broken leg. Rescued by helicopter. Human interest story. Survival against the odds. They interviewed the SAR team lead, who said all the right things about determination and the will to live. They didn't interview me. By the time reporters came around, I was in surgery getting 3 toes removed from my right foot. By the time I was coherent enough to talk, the story had moved on. Nobody asked me how I survived. Not really. They assumed they knew. Adrenaline, they said. Survival instinct. The human body's remarkable capacity for endurance. They found me surrounded by a shelter I didn't build. They photographed tracks I didn't make. They wrote it all down in their reports, and then they explained it away with words like probable and distorted and weather-related anomaly. Because that's what people do when the truth doesn't fit their paperwork. I stopped trying to correct them a long time ago. Told a reporter once, about 2 years back. Young guy from a Billings paper who was writing something about wilderness survival. I started explaining what actually kept me alive out there, and I watched his face change. Watched him decide I was a confused old man whose memory had gone soft around the edges. He nodded politely and never called again. There was a night nurse here who listened to the whole thing. She patted my hand when I was finished and suggested I might benefit from talking to the facility chaplain. Like what I saw was a spiritual crisis instead of a physical fact. So I stopped, kept it to myself, turned it over in my head during the long nights when sleep won't come and the heating system clicks on and off like a metronome. But I'm not going to die with this story inside me. The inheritance case has stalled out. My lawyer says it could drag on another 5 years, and I don't have 5 years left. My son and daughter haven't spoken to me since the hospital. The cabin sits empty. 40 acres that my father worked with his own 2 hands, just rotting while attorneys send each other letters. What I'm about to tell you isn't the whole truth. The whole truth would take longer than either of us has patience for. But it's the part that matters. The part I've never said out loud, start to finish, to anyone. You can believe it or not. That's your business. But I was there. I know what I saw. And I know what it means when your own blood leaves you to die, and something else, something that shouldn't exist, according to every official report ever written, decides that you won't. My father homesteaded that property in 1953. 40 acres up a Forest Service road that didn't even have a number back then, just a track through the lodgepole pine that the timber companies had cut decades earlier. He was 24 years old, fresh back from Korea, and he wanted to be somewhere quiet, somewhere the world couldn't find him unless he wanted to be found. He built the cabin himself over 3 summers, cut the logs by hand, notched them the way his grandfather had taught him back in Minnesota. No electricity, no running water, just 4 walls and a wood stove, and a view of the Absaroka Range that stopped your breath every single morning. I was born in Cody, but that cabin was where I became myself. My father used to say the land was worth more than what the paper claimed. And I never understood what he meant until he was gone and I was the one standing on that porch at dawn, watching elk move through the meadow below. I was married twice. The first one didn't last. Her name was Carol, and she gave me Wade before she decided that a game warden's salary and a game warden's hours weren't what she'd signed up for. Wade was 11 when she took him to Billings. I saw him summers after that, but something had curdled between us. He'd come up to the cabin and spend the whole week looking at his shoes, waiting to go back to his mother's house where there was television and other kids and a stepfather who worked in banking. Colleen was different. I met her in 1990 when I was 36, and I knew within a month that I'd marry her if she'd have me. She loved that land the way I did. Our daughter Christine was born in 92, and for a while there, maybe the best years of my life, we had something that felt permanent. Colleen and I would sit on that porch in the evenings while Christine played in the meadow, and I'd think, this is what my father meant. This is what the land is worth. Colleen died in February of 2019. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in October, gone by Valentine's Day. 4 months to watch the woman I loved disappear into a body that didn't work anymore. 4 months of hospitals and hospice, and that particular kind of exhaustion that grinds you down past bone. When she went, something went with her. My connection to Christine, mostly. They'd always been closer to each other than either of them was to me. That's nobody's fault. Just how it was. After the funeral, Christine went back to her life in Cheyenne, and the phone calls got shorter and further apart. I thought about selling the land. Not seriously, but the thought crossed my mind. The cabin felt emptier than it ever had, and every room held a memory that hurt to look at. But I couldn't do it. That land was my father's promise to himself, and it became my promise to him. And some promises don't break just because your heart does. Then Wade called. First time in nearly 2 years. He wanted to reconnect, he said. Family shouldn't drift apart. He'd been thinking about it since Colleen passed. How short life is, how grudges don't seem so important when you're looking at a casket. His voice sounded strange on the phone. Practiced, almost. Like he'd rehearsed what he was going to say. I should have paid attention to that. 31 years of reading people, reading situations, reading danger, and I ignored every instinct I had because I wanted to believe him. Because even at 68 years old, even after everything, I still wanted my son to love me. He suggested we meet in Billings to talk things through. All three of us. Me, him, and Christine. One big family conversation. I said yes. The meeting was set for September 15th, 2019, a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were always the days Colleen and I used to drive into Cody for groceries, and some part of my brain was still running on that schedule even 7 months after she was gone. I caught myself thinking about what she'd want from the store before I remembered there was no she anymore, no store trip, just a 3-hour drive to Billings to sit in a room with my children and talk about land. Wade had arranged everything. The law office was downtown, one of those places with dark wood furniture and framed diplomas covering every inch of wall space. The kind of place designed to make you feel like important things happened there. I showed up 15 minutes early because that's how my father raised me. Wade and Christine were already seated when the receptionist walked me back. They'd taken chairs on one side of the conference table. I noticed that immediately. Not spread out, not casual, shoulder to shoulder, like they were presenting a united front. Christine didn't meet my eyes when I came in. Wade stood up and shook my hand like I was a client instead of his father. There was a lawyer there too. Young guy, couldn't have been more than 35, with one of those haircuts that probably cost more than my monthly groceries. He introduced himself, but I don't remember the name. What I remember is the stack of documents in front of him. Must have been 40 pages, maybe 50. All that paper for 40 acres and a cabin. Wade started talking before I'd even settled into my chair. He had a whole presentation ready. Estate planning, probate complications, tax implications. He threw around phrases like streamlined transfer and avoiding unnecessary legal exposure and protecting the family's interests. Christine nodded along but didn't say much, just watched. That was always her way, even as a girl. Colleen used to say Christine was the kind of person who learned more by listening than talking. I let Wade finish. Took me about 10 minutes to realize what he was actually proposing. The documents weren't about estate planning. They were about transfer. Full transfer, immediate while I was still breathing. I'd sign over the cabin, the land, all 40 acres that my father had worked his whole life to keep, and in exchange I'd get nothing. No right to live there. No provision for continued residence. Just my signature on a line and 4 generations of Pritchard history handed over to my children like a piece of furniture they'd inherited early. I asked about the cabin. Where would I live if I signed this? Wade said they'd work something out. Christine studied her hands. I asked why it had to happen now. Why the rush? I was 68 years old, not 90. I had years left, probably. Decades, maybe. Wade's face did something then. A flicker, just for a second, like a mask slipping. He said something about wanting to settle things while everyone was healthy. He said it was better to handle these matters proactively. He said a lot of words that meant nothing at all. I looked at Christine, really looked at her, for the first time since I'd walked into that room. She was 37 years old. I'd held her the day she was born. I'd taught her to fish in the creek below the cabin, to identify elk tracks versus mule deer, to read weather and the way clouds stacked over the peaks. She was my daughter, and she couldn't look at me. I said no. The room went quiet. Not comfortable quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. Wade started to argue. Something about being reasonable, about thinking of the family, about not letting sentiment cloud practical judgment. I let him talk. When he was done, I stood up. I told them the land wasn't for sale, wasn't for transfer, that it would pass to them when I was dead and buried, the way my father had passed it to me. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. Wade's jaw tightened. Then he took a breath, and his whole demeanor shifted. Softer, more like the boy I remembered, or at least a performance of that boy. He suggested we take some time. Go up to the cabin for a few days, just the three of us. Talk it through as a family. Like old times. Every instinct I had said no. I said yes. 3 weeks later, mid-October, I was sitting in the back seat of Wade's truck watching the landscape change outside the window. We'd left Cody around noon, heading northwest toward the Shoshone. The sky was that particular blue you only get in Wyoming in autumn, deep and clean and so bright it almost hurt to look at. Wade drove. Christine sat up front in the passenger seat. I had the back to myself, which suited me fine. Gave me space to think, space to watch, and I was watching. 31 years with game and fish teaches you to notice things. The way animals move when something's wrong. The way a forest goes quiet before a storm. The way people behave when they're hiding something. I'd spent 3 decades reading those signs, and I was reading them now. Wade and Christine talked to each other in half sentences, fragments of conversations that seemed to start before I could hear them and end before I could understand. Little glances in the rearview mirror that stopped when they noticed me looking. Nothing obvious. Nothing I could point to and say, "There, that's wrong." Just a feeling. A wrongness in the air, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. We stopped in Cody to pick up supplies. I'd made a list. Enough food for 5 days, which was the plan. Canned goods, dried meat, coffee, the basics. When I came out of the store, Wade and Christine were loading the truck with half of what I'd written down. I asked about it. Wade said we didn't need that much. Said he'd rather travel light. I didn't argue. Should have. Didn't. The drive from town to the cabin took another 2 hours on roads that got worse the further we went. The last stretch wasn't really a road at all, just a pair of ruts through the trees that my father had cut 60 years ago and that I'd maintained ever since. Wade's truck handled it fine, but he was white-knuckling the steering wheel the whole way. City driving hadn't prepared him for this. I watched the forest pass outside my window and tried to remember the last time Wade had been up here. Must have been 15 years, maybe more. He'd stopped coming after college. Said he didn't see the point. Said there was nothing up here but trees and silence and memories he didn't want. That had hurt, hearing that. Still hurts, if I'm honest. The weather forecast I'd checked before we left showed a cold front moving in. Unusual for mid-October, even at this elevation, but not unprecedented. I mentioned it to Wade. He said it would be fine, said we'd be gone before it hit. We reached the cabin at dusk. The light was going golden through the trees, the way it does that time of year. And for just a moment, the whole scene looked exactly like it had when I was a boy. When my father would bring me up here, and we'd stand on the porch together watching the elk come down to the meadow. Then Christine got out of the truck and walked past me without a word, and the moment broke. I unloaded my gear while Wade and Christine went inside. When I came through the door, they were standing in the main room talking quietly. They stopped when they saw me. I asked if everything was all right. Wade smiled, said everything was fine, said it was good to be back. Christine still wouldn't look at me. I told myself I was imagining things, told myself I was a paranoid old man who'd spent too many years looking for trouble in the backcountry. Told myself my own children wouldn't hurt me. I was right about one of those things. The first 2 days at the cabin were an exercise in pretending. We ate meals together at the table my father built in 1958, the same table where I'd learned to play cards, where Colleen and I had celebrated anniversaries, where 4 generations of Pritchards had broken bread. Now we sat there pushing food around our plates and talking about nothing. Wade brought up the paperwork twice on the first day, 3 times on the second. Each time his tone was casual, like he was mentioning the weather. Just something to think about. Just worth discussing. Just a practical matter that reasonable people could agree on. I said no each time, and each time the silence afterward got a little heavier. Christine barely spoke at all. She spent most of her time on the porch or in the back bedroom that used to be hers, the one Colleen had decorated with wildflower curtains when Christine was 12. I tried to talk to her once, the evening of the second day. Asked her how she was really doing, if everything was all right at home. She looked at me for a long moment, and I swear I saw something in her eyes, something that wanted to say more. But then Wade called from the other room and the moment passed. On the morning of the third day, Wade suggested a hike. He wanted to go up to Elk Ridge, he said. The spot I'd taken him to when he was 14, the summer before Carol took him to Billings. He remembered the view, he said. Remembered how we'd sat up there for hours watching the valley below. It would be good to see it again. I should have said no. Something in my gut was screaming at me to say no. But Wade was smiling, actually smiling, for the first time since we'd arrived. And I wanted so badly to believe that smile was real, that my son was still in there somewhere, underneath all the years of silence and resentment, that this trip might actually fix something. Christine stayed behind. Headache, she said. She'd rest and have lunch ready when we got back. We left around 8 in the morning. October 17th, 2019. Clear skies, temperature in the low 40s, a light wind from the northwest. I remember these details because that's what 31 years as a warden does to you. You notice conditions. You file them away. You never know when they'll matter. The hike started normally enough. We followed the creek drainage for the first mile, then cut up slope through a stand of Engelmann spruce that I'd walked 100 times. But somewhere around the 2-mile mark, Wade started leading us off the route I remembered. Higher, he said. Better views higher up. I told him we were going the wrong way. He said he knew a shortcut. I should have insisted, should have turned around right there. But I was 68 years old, and my son was finally talking to me, finally spending time with me, and I didn't want to ruin it by being difficult. We climbed for another hour. The terrain got rougher, loose rock, steep grades, the kind of ground that makes you watch every step. We were above the tree line by then, maybe 9,200 feet, in country I didn't recognize from this angle. The wind had picked up. The sky was still clear, but I could feel the weather changing. That pressure drop that tells you something's coming. Wade stopped at the edge of a scree slope, steep, maybe 30 degrees, covered in loose granite chunks ranging from fist-sized to basketball-sized. Not the kind of terrain you want to cross if you don't have to. He said he needed to check his phone, see if he could get a signal. I walked past him toward what looked like an overlook, a flat spot where the ridge dropped away. I wanted to see the valley, get my bearings, figure out where we actually were. I heard him move behind me, and then his hands were on my back, and I was falling. The world became a tumbling chaos of rock and sky and pain. I hit something with my right leg, heard the snap before I felt it, and then I was sliding, rolling, bouncing off stones that tore at my clothes and skin. I came to rest at the bottom of the slope, maybe 20 feet down, wedged against a boulder. I looked up. Wade stood at the top, silhouetted against the October sky. His face was blank, empty, like he was looking at a stranger. 7 words, that's all he said. "Sorry, Dad, it's just easier this way." Then he turned and walked away, and I was alone. I listened to his footsteps until I couldn't hear them anymore. Boots on loose rock, getting fainter, then nothing. Just wind, just my own breathing, ragged and wrong-sounding even to my ears. The first thing I did was take inventory. That's training. That's 31 years of responding to emergencies, of finding people in worse shape than me, of knowing that panic kills faster than almost anything else. You assess, you prioritize, you work the problem. Right femur, broken. I could feel the bones grinding when I tried to move, and there was a wrongness in the angle of my leg that told me this wasn't a clean fracture. Probably shattered, multiple pieces. I wasn't walking out of here. Ribs, at least 2 cracked, maybe 3. Every breath sent fire through my left side, but I could still breathe. Lungs intact. Small mercy. Pack. Gone. Wade must have taken it after I fell, or maybe I dropped it on the way down. Either way, I didn't have it. No food, no water purification, no emergency blanket, no first aid kit. Rifle? Gone. Same story. Phone. Never had one. Colleen used to tease me about that. Said I was a dinosaur. I told her I'd lived 60+ years without a phone in my pocket and didn't see the need to start. I patted down my pockets with hands that shook despite my best efforts to keep them steady. Breast pocket. The compact signal mirror I'd carried since 1983, a habit from my first year with game and fish. Front right pocket, a small folding knife, blade maybe 3 inches, the one Colleen had given me for our 10th anniversary. Left pocket, a half-empty tin of lip balm. That was it. That was everything I had to survive in the Absaroka Range with a shattered leg and night coming on. The sun was already tracking toward the western peaks. I figured I had maybe 4 hours of light left, and the temperature was dropping fast. The cold front the forecast had mentioned, it was coming. I could feel it in my joints, in the way the wind had shifted north. I managed to drag myself about 6 feet to a shallow depression against a large boulder. Not shelter, not really, but it blocked the worst of the wind from one direction. Every inch of movement sent pain screaming through my leg, white hot and absolute. By the time I'd wedged myself into position, I was drenched in sweat despite the cold. Then I started screaming. Not for Wade, I knew he wasn't coming back. I screamed for anyone, hikers, hunters, forest service, anyone who might be within earshot. I screamed until my voice cracked and gave out, until my throat felt like I'd swallowed broken glass. Nobody answered. The silence out there was absolute. Not just quiet, silent. No birds, no insects, no distant engine, noise. Just whine through rock and the occasional creak of timber from the tree line below. I'd spent my whole life in wild places, and I'd never heard silence like that. It was the sound of being completely, utterly alone. The temperature dropped below freezing before full dark. I know because I could see my breath, thick white clouds that the wind tore apart as soon as they formed. I had no way to make fire, no insulation beyond the clothes on my back. Flannel shirt, canvas jacket, jeans, boots. Not enough. Not nearly enough. I curled into myself as best I could with a broken leg, tucked my hands into my armpits, and waited for dawn. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. The pain wouldn't let me, and neither would the cold, and neither would the knowledge of what my son had done. I lay there in the dark, watching stars wheel overhead through gaps in the clouds, and I thought about dying. Not if, when. The sun came up on day 2 and I was still alive. That surprised me more than it should have. The cold had settled into my bones overnight, deep and permanent feeling, like it had always been there and always would be. My right leg had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The fabric of my jeans stretched tight against flesh that had turned purple-black in the hours since the fall. I didn't look at it more than I had to. Nothing I could do about it anyway. I decided to move. Not because I thought I could walk out. I knew better. But lying still meant dying still, and something stubborn in me, the same something that had gotten me through 31 years of backcountry work, refused to make it easy. If I was going to die out here, I was going to die trying. I started dragging myself downslope. The direction didn't matter much. Down meant water eventually, and water meant a chance, however small. I used my left leg to push, my arms to pull, and I let my ruined right leg trail behind me like something that belonged to someone else. The pain was extraordinary. I don't have better words for it. Every movement sent shockwaves through my body that whited out my vision and left me gasping. I developed a rhythm. Push, pull, breathe, wait for the worst of it to pass, then do it again. I counted movements instead of distance. 10 pushes, then rest. 20 pushes, then rest. The numbers gave me something to focus on besides the grinding of bone fragments inside my thigh. By midday, I'd covered maybe 100 yards. The sun was warm enough that I stopped shivering for a few hours, which felt like a gift. I found a depression in the rock where snowmelt had pooled, maybe half a cup of water with dirt and pine needles floating in it. I drank it anyway. Giardia takes weeks to make you sick. Dehydration kills in days. I kept crawling until the light started to fade. Another 100 yards, maybe less. 200 yards total for a full day's effort. At that rate, it would take me weeks to reach anywhere that mattered. And I didn't have weeks, I probably didn't have days. That night was worse than the first. The cold front had arrived in full, and the temperature dropped well below 20. I found a cluster of rocks that blocked some of the wind and wedged myself between them, shaking so hard my teeth rattled. I thought about Colleen, about the cabin sitting empty, about Wade and Christine driving back to their lives while I froze to death on a mountainside. I started composing messages in my head, things I'd say to people if I could. Apologies mostly. Regrets. The kinds of things you think about when you're pretty sure you're not going to see morning. Somewhere in the darkest part of the night, I caught a smell. It came on the wind from upslope. Thick, musky, organic. Not quite rot, not quite animal, but something in between. I'd smelled bear before, hundreds of times. Elk, deer, moose, wolverine, mountain lion. I knew what wildlife smelled like. This wasn't that. My warden brain tried to categorize it automatically, the way it had categorized 10,000 sensory inputs over 3 decades of fieldwork. It failed. Whatever I was smelling didn't fit any category I had. I told myself it was my brain misfiring. Hypothermia does strange things to perception. Oxygen deprivation, dehydration, shock, any of them could cause hallucinations. Olfactory hallucinations weren't common, but they weren't impossible either. The smell faded after a few minutes. The wind shifted, carrying it away into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night either. But now it wasn't just the cold and the pain keeping me awake. It was the feeling, bone deep and irrational, that something out there was watching me. Day 4 changed everything. I'd stopped crawling by then. Stopped trying to move at all, really. The effort to progress ratio had become absurd, and my body was shutting down in ways I recognized from decades of finding people who hadn't made it out of the wilderness. The shivering had become intermittent rather than constant, which wasn't a good sign. My thoughts were getting fuzzy around the edges. I was entering the territory where people started making fatal mistakes, wandering in circles, shedding clothes, lying down to rest and never getting up. I'd accepted, in a clinical way, that I was going to die out here. The math didn't work any other way. No food, no fire, no shelter, no ability to move, and no rescue coming because whoever was looking for me, if anyone was looking at all, was searching in the wrong place. Wade would have told them I wandered off, got confused, went the wrong direction. They'd be combing the drainage east of the cabin while I lay here on the wrong side of a ridge they had no reason to check. But something was different now. That feeling I'd had on night 3 of being watched hadn't gone away with the sunrise. If anything, it had intensified. I've spent my life reading the woods. You develop a sense for when you're alone and when you're not. Animals give themselves away in 100 small ways. Disturbed birds, snapped twigs, the particular quality of silence that means something large is holding still nearby. I knew those signs better than I knew my own handwriting. Something was out there, something that had been watching me for hours, maybe longer, from somewhere upslope. The smell came back around midday. That same thick musk, stronger than before, close enough that I knew whatever was producing it couldn't be more than 50 or 60 yards away. I scanned the tree line with eyes that didn't work as well as they used to, looking for movement, for shape, for anything that would tell me what I was dealing with. Nothing. Just trees and rock and shadow. That night I saw the eyes. I'd taken out my folding knife, not because I thought I could defend myself with a 3-inch blade, but because it was something to hold, something solid and real in a situation that was starting to feel like a fever dream. The blade caught the starlight, reflected it back in a dull gleam, and up the slope, maybe 40 yards away, 2 points of light reflected back. Eye shine. Every warden knows eye shine. You see it in your headlights, in your flashlight beam, in any artificial light that catches an animal's tapetum lucidum at the right angle. Different animals have different colors. Deer shine yellow-green, coyotes bright green, bears orange-red. These eyes were set too high off the ground. Way too high. I was looking at them from a prone position, and they were still above my natural sight line. Whatever was attached to those eyes was standing, and it was tall. Much taller than a bear on all fours. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. I watched back. We stayed that way for what felt like hours, me lying broken among the rocks, those eyes hovering in the darkness upslope. My heart should have been pounding. I should have been terrified. But I was too far gone for that. Too depleted to manufacture the appropriate fear response. When dawn finally came, the eyes were gone. But in the soft earth at the edge of the tree line, I could see where something heavy had stood. Branches bent at shoulder height, high shoulder height, higher than any man I'd ever met, and the smell lingered, fading slowly as the morning warmed. I filed it away. Observation without interpretation. That's what training does for you. I didn't know what was watching me, but I knew with absolute certainty that I wasn't alone anymore. I woke on what I believe was day 5 to find food within arm's reach. I say believe because by then time had become slippery. The days blurred together in a haze of cold and pain and thirst. I'd stopped trying to track the sun's movement, stopped counting the nights. My body was shutting down in stages, and my mind was following. But that morning, whatever morning it was, I came back to consciousness with the pale light of dawn filtering through the clouds, and there was something on the ground beside me that hadn't been there before. A small pile, maybe the size of 2 fists put together. I stared at it for a long time before my brain made sense of what I was seeing. Roots, crushed and pulped, the fibers broken down in a way that suggested processing, pounding, or chewing. Strips of bark that I recognized as lodgepole pine, the inner layer that holds some nutritional value if you're desperate enough. A handful of late-season berries, the kind that cling to bushes into October if the frost hasn't been too hard. I hadn't heard anything approach. My position against the boulder hadn't changed. I was certain as I could be of anything by then, that I'd been alone when I fell asleep. The warden part of my brain, the part that had spent 31 years observing and cataloging, kicked in automatically. I examined the pile without touching it. The roots had been processed recently. They were still moist, not dried out by exposure. The berries were intact, not scattered, placed deliberately in a cluster. The bark strips were uniform in size, torn with what looked like intention rather than randomness. This wasn't foraging. This wasn't windfall. This was provision. I ate it. All of it. I didn't have the luxury of caution or suspicion. My body was consuming itself, burning through whatever reserves I had left. The roots tasted like wet wood and dirt. The bark was bitter, fibrous, hard to swallow. The berries were the only thing approaching palatable, tart and cold and gone in seconds. It wasn't much. maybe a few hundred calories total. But it was something, and something was more than I'd had in days. That night, the eyes returned. Watching from the same position upslope, that same steady glow reflecting the faint starlight. I watched back until I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore, and when I woke again at dawn, there was more food. A rabbit this time. Dead, laid out on a flat stone about 2 feet from my head. I made myself examine it before I touched it. That same clinical observation that had become my only tool for making sense of any of this. The neck was broken. Clean break, no tearing, no tooth marks. I'd seen hundreds of rabbit kills over my career. Coyote, fox, hawk, owl, bobcat. Every predator leaves a signature. Teeth puncture flesh. Talons tear. Even a quick kill leaves evidence of the method. This rabbit had no marks at all. Just the broken neck, as if someone had simply reached down and twisted. No blood. No damage to the fur. No sign of struggle. I thought about what kind of grip strength that would require. What kind of hands. I ate the rabbit raw, didn't have a choice. I used my folding knife to skin it as best I could with hands that shook and cramped, then tore the meat from the bones in strips. It was gamey and tough and tasted like survival. I ate until there was nothing left but fur and skeleton, and then I lay back against my boulder and waited. Day 7 brought more roots, more bark, and something new. A clutch of grubs arranged on another flat stone. Beetle larvae, maybe, or something similar. Protein, fat, calories my body desperately needed. I stopped questioning where it came from, stopped trying to rationalize or explain. Whatever was watching me, whatever had decided to keep me alive, it was doing a better job than I could have done for myself. The food appeared each morning like clockwork, placed within reach while I slept, never disturbing me, never making a sound. Fear is a strange thing. It requires energy, and I didn't have energy to spare. What replaced it was something I still struggled to name. Gratitude, maybe, though that seems too simple. Acceptance, though that implies understanding. I accepted without understanding. I was grateful without knowing what I was grateful to. I just knew that something out there had made a choice, and the choice was that I would live. Day 8. I'm certain of that one because it's the day I saw it clearly for the first time, and some experiences burn themselves into your memory with a precision that ordinary moments can't match. The sky was just starting to lighten, that gray pre-dawn when the stars fade but the sun hasn't crested the peaks yet. I'd been drifting in and out of consciousness for hours, that shallow, almost sleep that was all my body could manage anymore. And something pulled me back to awareness. Not a sound, not a movement, just a feeling. That same feeling I'd had since day 4, of being watched, but stronger now, closer. I opened my eyes and looked upslope. It was standing among the scattered pines at the edge of the tree line. Maybe 30 yards away, maybe a little more. In the dim light, it was hard to judge distance, but it was close enough to see clearly. Close enough that there was no mistaking what I was looking at. Tall. That was the first thing. 7 feet at least, probably more. I'd met plenty of big men in my life. Loggers, ranchers, the occasional basketball player passing through Cody. But this wasn't in the same category. This was a different kind of scale altogether. The proportions were wrong. That's the part that sticks with me most, even now. Everything about it was almost right, but not quite. Shoulders too broad for the height, arms too long, hanging past where human arms would end. Legs bent slightly at the knee in a way that suggested coiled power, like a spring compressed and waiting. The whole body covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, but hair, dense and matted, the color of old pine bark. It stood motionless, absolutely still in a way that living things rarely achieve. No shifting of weight, no turning of the head, no visible breathing, just watching. those eyes fixed on me with an intensity I could feel even across the distance. I watched back. I was too weak to feel afraid. That's the truth of it. Fear is a survival mechanism, and my survival mechanisms had been running on empty for days. What I felt instead was something closer to recognition. Not familiarity. I'd never seen anything like this in my life, and I knew I never would again. But recognition of intelligence, of awareness, of a mind behind those eyes that was studying me the same way I was studying it. 3 minutes, maybe longer. Neither of us moved. Then it turned, smooth and fluid, no wasted motion, and it walked into the trees. I say walked because that's the closest word, but it wasn't quite walking. It was movement that seemed to ignore the underbrush, the fallen branches, the uneven ground. Silent, effortless, like it was part of the forest in a way that no human being could ever be. I lay there for a long time after it was gone. The sun came up, the day warmed slightly. I ate the food that had appeared sometime in the night. More roots, more bark, a few mushrooms I recognized as edible from my years in the field, and I thought about what I'd seen. I'm not a man who believes in things without evidence. 31 years of warden work teaches you to trust your observations, to separate fact from speculation, to report what you saw rather than what you think you saw. I know what a bear looks like. I know what an elk looks like. I know the silhouette of every large mammal in the Wyoming wilderness. This wasn't any of them. I didn't have a name for it. Still don't, really. The words people use, the popular words, the tabloid words, they don't fit. They carry too much baggage, too many assumptions, too much mockery and sensationalism. So I just called it the creature in my head, and that's what I still call it now. What I knew, lying there in the growing daylight on day 8 of my ordeal, was this. Something that shouldn't exist had decided to keep me alive. And for reasons I couldn't explain then and can't explain now, I believed, for the first time since Wade pushed me down that slope, that I might actually survive. Days 9 and 10 blur together in my memory, like watercolors bleeding into each other. The cold had deepened, that second wave of the front pushing through, and my body was losing the battle against it. I'd stopped shivering consistently, which I knew from decades of wilderness work was a very bad sign. The shivering reflex burns calories to generate heat. When it stops, it means your body has decided it can't afford the energy anymore. It means you're entering the final stages. I drifted, in and out of awareness, in and out of dreams that felt more real than waking. I saw Colleen sitting beside me, clear as day, telling me it wasn't my time yet. I saw my father standing at the edge of the tree line, young again, the way he'd looked when I was a boy. I saw Wade's face above me on the scree slope, expressionless, and I heard those 7 words over and over like a recording stuck on repeat. Somewhere in that fog, the world around me changed. I can't tell you exactly when it happened. Can't point to a moment and say, there, that's when I noticed. It was gradual, like waking from anesthesia, reality assembling itself in pieces. But at some point during those 2 days, I became aware that there was something around me that hadn't been there before. Branches, leaned against the boulder I'd wedged myself against, arranged at angles that created a rough lean-to shape. Not just thrown there, placed with intention, the thick ends braced against the rock and the thinner ends meeting overhead. Bark strips woven through the gaps, not perfectly but well enough to block the worst of the wind. A layer of pine boughs on the ground beside me, insulation between my body and the frozen earth. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I hadn't built this. I knew that with absolute certainty. I'd barely been conscious for 48 hours. My right leg was a swollen mass of purple-black flesh that I couldn't move without screaming. I hadn't built anything. but someone had. My memories of those days include fragments that might be real or might be fever dreams. The sound of branches snapping somewhere nearby. Not the sharp crack of deadfall, but the deliberate sound of wood being broken to length. A shape at the edge of my vision, massive and dark, moving with that same fluid silence I'd seen on day 8. The smell, that thick organic musk, closer than it had ever been. And underneath it all, that low, huffing breath, rhythmic and steady, like something large working at a task. When I was lucid enough to examine the construction, really examine it, with the analytical eye that 31 years of fieldwork had trained, I saw things that made my breath catch. The branches weren't random sizes. They were selected, graduated from thick to thin, arranged to maximize stability. The bark strips weren't just stuffed into gaps. They were woven, threaded through in patterns that suggested understanding of how materials interlock. The overall structure was oriented to block the prevailing wind, which came from the northwest. Whoever, whatever, had built this understood insulation, understood wind direction, understood the problem they were solving. This wasn't instinct. This wasn't accident. This was architecture. I lay inside that crude shelter as the temperature dropped below 15 degrees, and I was warmer than I'd been since the first night. Not warm, not comfortable, but survivable. The difference between dying and not dying. I thought about the food, the processed roots, the clean-killed rabbits, the deliberate placement. I thought about the eyes watching me night after night. I thought about the figure in the tree line, those 3 minutes of mutual observation. Something had assessed my situation. Something had identified my needs. Something had intervened. I still didn't understand why. I don't understand why now, but I stopped questioning it. I just let myself be grateful and I let myself sleep. Day 11 started with the closest encounter of all. I woke slowly, pulled out of a dreamless sleep by that same feeling of being watched. By now I'd grown almost accustomed to it, that prickling awareness on the back of my neck, that certainty of observation. But this was different, stronger, immediate. I opened my eyes. It was crouched near a deadfall maybe 10 feet from where I lay. 10 feet. Close enough to touch in a few strides. Close enough to see details that distance had hidden before. The face wasn't human. I need to say that clearly. But it wasn't animal either, not in any way I could categorize. The features were heavy, pronounced, a thick brow ridge, a broad nose, a jaw that seemed built for power. The skin beneath the facial hair was dark, weathered-looking, like old leather left too long in the sun. But the eyes were something else entirely. Deep-set, dark, fixed on me with an intensity that felt almost physical, intelligent. That's the only word that fits. Not cunning, not predatory, not the reactive awareness of a wild animal assessing threat. Intelligent in a way that felt familiar, recognizable, almost human. It was studying me, the way a person studies something they're trying to understand. In the growing morning light, I could see more than I'd seen before. The hands were massive but proportioned like hands. Fingers, thumbs, joints that bent the right directions. The chest rose and fell with slow, measured breathing. The posture, even crouched, conveyed a sense of contained strength that was almost overwhelming. This thing could have killed me at any moment over the past week. Could have killed me now without effort. Instead, it made a sound. Low, so low I felt it more than heard it. A vibration in my chest cavity, in my teeth. Not threatening, not aggressive. Almost, and I know how this sounds, almost gentle. Like a vocalization meant to communicate something that words couldn't carry. I don't know what it meant. I'll never know. But I felt something pass between us in that moment. Acknowledgement, maybe. Recognition. The end of something. It rose to its full height, 7 feet easily, maybe closer to 8. Standing there in the gray dawn light framed by the pines, it looked like something from another era entirely. Something that had been walking these mountains since before my father's father was born, since before anyone thought to draw maps or build cabins or claim this land as their own. It looked at me one more time. Then it turned and walked into the trees. It didn't look back. I lay there in the shelter it had built, surrounded by the evidence of its intervention, and I listened to the silence it left behind. Within 2 hours, I heard the helicopter, the signal mirror. I'd almost forgotten I had it. I pulled it from my breast pocket with hands that barely worked anymore, and caught the sun when I heard the rotors. Flash, flash, flash. The old pattern. They found me. They saved me. And the creature that had kept me alive for a week disappeared into a wilderness that pretends it doesn't exist. The helicopter touched down about 200 yards from my position. I remember the sound of the rotors more than anything else. That rhythmic thunder that meant rescue, that meant survival, that meant the 11-day nightmare was finally ending. 2 SAR team members reached me first, a man and a woman in bright orange jackets, moving fast but careful across the rocky ground. The man knelt beside me and said my name. "Dwayne? Dwayne, can you hear me? You're going to be okay. We've got you." I tried to respond, but my voice came out as a croak. Hadn't spoken aloud in days. Hadn't had reason to. They worked quickly, professionally. Assessed my leg, my breathing, my responsiveness. Started an IV line right there on the ground. Fluids to combat the dehydration that had nearly killed me. Wrapped me in thermal blankets that felt like they'd been heated by the sun itself. The woman kept talking to me the whole time, calm and steady, using my first name over and over like an anchor. I remember trying to tell them about the shelter, about the food, about what I'd seen. But the words wouldn't come out right, and they were focused on keeping me alive, not on listening to what must have sounded like the ramblings of a hypothermic old man. They loaded me onto a stretcher and carried me to the helicopter. As we lifted off, I looked down at the spot where I'd spent 11 days dying and not dying. From the air, the shelter was clearly visible, that crude structure of branches and bark leaning against the boulder. One of the crew members followed my gaze and said something about remarkable survival instinct. "Adrenaline and the will to live," he said. "The human body is capable of incredible things." I didn't argue. Didn't have the strength. The hospital in Cody became my world for the next 3 weeks. Surgery on my leg, multiple pins, metal plates, hardware that still sets off airport detectors to this day. Skin grafts on my hands and face where the frostbite had done its worst. And eventually, the amputation of 3 toes on my right foot, the tissue too damaged to save. The sheriff's deputy came on day 4. Young guy, professional, notebook open and pen ready. He asked me what happened on the mountain, how I got separated from my hunting party. I told him I didn't get separated. I told him I was pushed. He wrote that down. Then he asked me to describe exactly what happened, and I did. The hike, the scree slope, Wade's hands on my back. Those 7 words. The deputy's face stayed neutral the whole time, but I could see the wheels turning. He was measuring my account against something else, something he'd already heard. Wade and Christine had given their statements 2 days earlier, while I was still in surgery. They'd gotten separated in fog, they said. They'd searched for 2 days before, calling authorities. They'd been frantic, terrified, beside themselves with worry. Fog. There hadn't been any fog that morning. Clear skies, light wind from the northwest. I remembered the conditions, like I remembered my own name. But I'd also been lying on a mountain for 11 days with a broken leg, hypothermic, delirious. The deputy didn't say it outright, but I could hear the implication in his questions. Memory is unreliable under extreme stress. Trauma distorts perception. An elderly man in survival conditions might misremember, might conflate, might fill in gaps with fears rather than facts. No witnesses, no evidence. My word against theirs. A Forest Service ranger documented the scene a few days later, photographed the shelter, which his report described as a self-constructed survival structure consistent with instinctive emergency response. Photographed the tracks too, 5-toed prints pressed deep into the mud, 18 inches long, stride length, suggesting something very large. Probable bear, he wrote, distorted by freeze-thaw cycles. I watched him write those words, watched him frown slightly before committing ink to paper. That moment of hesitation that told me he knew something didn't quite fit. Then the moment passed, and the official story became official. No charges were filed. Case closed. 5 years. That's how long I've carried this. The physical recovery took the better part of a year, learning to walk again with a leg full of hardware and 3 missing toes, building back the strength I'd lost, the muscle mass, the endurance. I was 68 when I went up that mountain. By the time I was functional again, I was pushing 70 and feeling every year of it. The cabin was out of the question. I couldn't live alone anymore, couldn't manage the isolation, couldn't handle the daily realities of a property that required constant maintenance. I sold my house in Cody and moved into Mountain View Assisted Care in Thermopolis. Nice enough place. Clean rooms, decent food, staff that treats you like a person instead of a problem. But it's not home. It's where you go when home isn't an option anymore. The legal battle started almost immediately. Wade and Christine filed a petition to have me declared incompetent, to take control of the property for my own protection. When that failed, they pivoted to a straight inheritance dispute, claiming that verbal promises I'd allegedly made years earlier constituted a binding agreement. The lawyers have been feeding on it ever since, billing hours, filing motions, scheduling hearings that get postponed and rescheduled and postponed again. The 40 acres my father homesteaded in 1953, the cabin he built with his own hands, the land where I learned to track elk and read weather and love the wilderness. It sits empty now. Neither side can touch it while the case drags on. The roof is probably leaking. The porch is probably rotting. 4 generations of Pritchard history slowly surrendering to entropy while attorneys exchange letters. I tried to tell the full story a few times. The reporter from Billings who was writing about wilderness survival, I gave him the whole thing, start to finish, watched his expression shift from interest to concern to something like pity. He never followed up. The article he eventually published mentioned me as a footnote, a brief example of extreme survival, with no reference to anything I'd actually said. There was a fellow resident here, a former geology professor named Harold, who seemed genuinely curious. I told him about the creature, about the shelter, about those final moments before the helicopter came. He listened patiently, asked thoughtful questions, and then suggested I might want to write it down as a therapeutic exercise, like it was a dream I needed to process rather than an event I'd survived. The night nurse was the last one. She caught me on a bad night, when the memories were too loud and sleep wouldn't come. I told her everything, and she held my hand and looked at me with those kind, gentle eyes. And when I was finished, she suggested I speak with the facility chaplain. After that, I stopped trying. Not because I doubted what I saw. I know what I saw. But some truths ask too much of people. They require a reorganization of everything you think you know about the world, and most people aren't willing to do that. It's easier to file the story under trauma or confusion or age and move on. So I kept it inside, turned it over in my mind during the long nights when the facility goes quiet and the heating system clicks, and I'm alone with memories that won't fade no matter how much I want them to. Until now. I'm 72 years old. My health isn't what it was, and I've made peace with the fact that I probably don't have many years left. The doctors don't say it outright, but I can read the concern in their faces, the way they pause before delivering test results, the increasing frequency of referrals to specialists who specialize in things you don't want to need specialists for. That's part of why I'm telling this now. Not because I expect anyone to believe me. I gave up on that a long time ago. But because some truths shouldn't die with the people who carry them. Because somewhere in the Absaroka Range, something exists that every official report says doesn't exist, and I'm one of the few people alive who knows that for certain. I think about the land sometimes, that 40 acres sitting empty, the cabins slowly falling apart, the meadow where Colleen and I used to watch elk at dawn. Wade and Christine are still fighting over it, still paying lawyers, still waiting for me to die so the whole thing becomes simpler. I haven't spoken to either of them since the hospital. They never visited, never called, never sent a card or a letter or even a message through an attorney. I used to wonder if they felt guilt. If Wade lay awake at night, thinking about those 7 words, about the sound of my body hitting the rocks, about the father he left to die on a mountainside. If Christine ever questioned her headache, her decision to stay behind, her corroboration of a story she must have known was false. I don't wonder anymore. Some people are capable of things that other people can't imagine, and then they're capable of living with those things afterward. My son pushed me off a cliff for money. My daughter helped cover it up. That's the truth, and no amount of wondering will change it. But here's the other truth, the one that matters more to me now. My own blood left me to die, and something else decided I wouldn't. I don't know why. I've spent 5 years turning that question over, examining it from every angle, and I still don't have an answer. Maybe it saw something in me that seemed worth saving. Maybe it was curious about the broken creature lying in its territory. Maybe compassion isn't as uniquely human as we like to believe, and something ancient in those mountains recognized suffering and chose to respond. Or maybe it was just chance. Wrong place, wrong time, a random intersection of 2 lives that should never have crossed? I don't know. I'll never know. What I know is what I saw. A creature that shouldn't exist, standing in the pre-dawn light, watching me with eyes that held intelligence and something that might have been kindness. A shelter I didn't build, food I didn't gather. A choice made by something that owed me nothing, that had no obligation to care, that could have walked past my dying body without a second thought. It didn't walk past. It stopped. It helped. And then, on that last morning, it made that sound, that low vibration I still feel in my chest sometimes when the nights are quiet. And it walked away without looking back, like it knew its work was done, like it had somewhere else to be, something else to attend to, a life in those mountains that had nothing to do with me. I think about that moment more than any other. Not the betrayal, not the cold, not the 11 days of waiting to die. I think about the creature rising to its full height, turning toward the trees, disappearing into a wilderness that keeps its secrets better than any human institution ever could. The official reports say it doesn't exist. The ranger wrote "probable bear" and moved on with his day. The world has a story it prefers, and my story doesn't fit. But I was there. I know what saved me. And somewhere in the Absaroka Range, something that isn't supposed to be real is still walking, still watching, still making choices that we don't have the framework to understand. Maybe it will find someone else someday. Someone lost, someone broken, someone left behind by the people who should have protected them. I hope it does. I hope whoever it finds has the sense to be grateful.